Hello, hello, and welcome. How are we doing today, team? Thank you for joining us today. And welcome to our fourth lesson on The Handmaid's Tale, and this on the theme of power. So looking forward to having more people join us. We're just getting started. Our tech is a little bit slow today, but hoping that I can see you all here. Fantastic. Hello, IGCSE. Thank you for joining us again. How are your exams going? Did you have your literature paper 2 already, or any more exams this week? If so, how did they go? Lovely to have everyone here. For those of us just joining, this is our fourth lesson on The Handmaid's Tale. So we are going to be getting into the theme of power. If this is your first lesson with us, consider taking a look back at lessons 1 through 3 as we look at introducing the novel, looking at the context for The Handmaid's Tale, as well as the genre of the postmodern novel, the dystopian novel, as well as speculative fiction, all of these ideas in our first lesson, as well as looking at the plot, the characters, the construction of the text, the setting, as well as the structure as well of the text. And then last lesson, this time last week, we took a look at Offred as a character and different lessons about, or different lenses rather, to look at Offred as a character. You have language paper 2 tomorrow. Very, very good luck. And physics and accounting. Congratulations, that is excellent. I hope you did well. Hope you'll let us know when you do here. Hello, Amid. Thank you for joining us. And just so you know, on our Eleanor Does English channel, we are providing loads of different resources to help broaden and deepen your knowledge for A-level English literature. Across different exam boards, we have on our channel offerings and a whole playlist on Othello, on A Streetcar Named Desire, on The Great Gatsby, and now on The Handmaid's Tale. We've also been doing an exam masterclass series where we've been providing deep dives, 3-hour live streams on different topics that are coming up for exam time to help you revise. Our last one, last Friday, was on unseen poetry, and our next exam masterclass is going to be on poetry comparisons, focusing particularly on Rossetti. I'm so glad, Garima, that's fantastic. Lovely to hear from you as well. So let's get started, shall we? And just a little introduction to me, if this is your first time joining. I'm Eleanor, I'm one of the teachers at My EdSpace, and we are offering free streams for Key Stage 5 students as well as GCSE students across the year to help with your revision and to help with your learning. So do let us know that it is helping you, and please continue joining us. We're here every Wednesday from 6:50 to 8:20. So let's lock in with our first idea about power. And this is, how is power presented in The Handmaid's Tale? Because after all, Atwood describes her novel as a study of power. In other words, an examination of power and different kinds of power. So thus, power must be an important theme in the novel. So let's think about how it appears. How does it appear? Put any ideas that you know from the chat. If you've been joining us for a while, then you will be able to contribute some ideas already. If you're just joining us, feel free to put any ideas you know about The Handmaid's Tale and power in the chat as well. This is part of our discussion. But I can get us started with some ideas, for example, about if this is a study of power, then that means it's looking at who has power, who doesn't have power. Who doesn't have power? How these systems of power appear? Or how power is institutionalized? What is gained with power? What does power look like? And what does it look like to lose power? Is there a hierarchy, a word that intrinsically has ideas about power in it, in terms of different levels of society, in which different levels of power then would be ascribed, right? Different kinds of power. How are these rules made and how are they maintained? How are these systems maintained? These are the questions we want to be asking as we're thinking about this as a study of power. And so some ideas for the Handmaid's Tale might already be coming to you. For example, the power of Gilead here, the place that we are, because it is, after all, a totalitarian government, a government in which the government has total control over its citizens. And that government has given power to men, to the sons of Jacob. Particularly, these divisions fall into commanders, eyes, and angels. So already, even in the naming of men in Gilead, we can see systems of power at play here, because these names are inherently powerful. Eyes, so this idea of surveillance and knowledge and information, as well as commanders, literally commanding power, and angels, this kind of protective spirit. But of course, we know the angels are the gods. So thinking of them as guardian angels is part of thinking of them as having some kind of divine power. The same with the eyes. The eyes are actually short for eyes of God. So thinking about them as, again, being aligned with divine power that gives them a kind of supernatural protection from the same blames and same powerlessnesses of the women in Gilead. So we're thinking about men's total power in Gilead as well. And we're thinking about this as sustained through the government, as well as sustained through systems of punishment, both of power and of punishment. And how is this punishment and power maintained? Well, particularly through violence and oppression. So we're thinking about the intense levels of violence across this text. This is quite a violent and shocking text at point. And particularly as well through the oppression of women. We see this in particular when we're thinking about the bifurcation of those who can read and those who cannot, or who it's not allowed to, those who can speak and those who are silent, because Offred as a handmaid is meant to be silent. And the handmaids in particular, partly enforced by their wings, are muffled and indeed silenced. We can hear them whispering to each other. That's even foregrounded in the first pages, in the first chapter of the text. But we can also think about their language as being policed. So we're thinking then about languages as systems both of power and resistance, because though The handmaids are meant to be silenced. They are also not. They are still whispering, that susurration that is like dried grass during the Pravaganza, for example. The fact that The Handmaid's Tale, these audio cassettes that are saved and discussed, the information, their kind of medium is revealed in the historical notes, is revealed as audio tape. So literally, Offred had to record them with tapes, which means that her voice is recorded, and thus, even though Gilead and even her own story, she and her fate has been silenced, her voice through The Handmaid's Tale carries on. However, we need to think about these systems of power as well, because it's not only the men who can speak and read, it's also the wives, right? Like Serena Joy, who do have some kind of power in this hierarchy. Who else has power? Well, the aunts, particularly Aunt Lydia, who can read and write and do have the permission to read as well as the permission to control the handmaid. So we can see here those who are dehumanized and the structures of dehumanizing others here that make a patriarchy, but particularly any kind of system of power, particularly insidious, is ensuring that those divisions remain. And if we're thinking about power and we're thinking about wives and aunts and handmaids and their relationship, we can certainly as well think about ideas of complicity here in oppression. Because the handmaids are oppressed not only by the men, by the commanders, but also by the wives and aunts, who also enact their own punishments and their own power dynamics and power trips, in some instances, on the handmaids as well, to preserve this system of haves and have-nots. We also think of sexuality having power in The Handmaid's Tale, because after all, this entire government is formed on the idea of control of reproduction. So this idea of Offred being a national resource, of being protected, that's why they have nice food, that's why they have a nice home to be looked after, and they don't have to do any kind of hard labor like the unwomen do, is because they are protected in some way, because their womb, their fertility gives them power. But that fertility is rigorously controlled, because sexuality itself in Gilead is dangerous. So sexuality is both powerful and dangerous then. So power comes with this idea of control, restriction. Oops. Trying to think and write at the same time. Control, restriction, who gets to speak, who gets to make decisions, who has in society and who doesn't. This also comes through ideas of information and surveillance through, for example, the eyes, but also through the climate of fear that's developed through the novel. And this is partly as a result of the omnipresent violence, but also it's through the idea that you don't really know where you are and you don't know who you can trust. And it seems that you can't trust anyone because everything is so destabilized. That's part of maintaining power in a totalitarian government, is making sure everyone else feels unstabilized, or destabilized, that they cannot maintain any kind of power or even perhaps sense of reality. We can also think of power as preserving, continuing, validating the patriarchy. We can use it as reinforced by both religion and science. For example, through the figure of the doctor, but also through the Bible that they've changed and corrupted in order to manipulate people into doing what they want. For example, when Offred says that they've changed the Bible, she knows it, but she can't check. As we said, we've got punishment, we've got the idea of power and corruption, taking, of course, the idea of absolute power corrupts absolutely here. And thinking about corruption, hypocrisy, especially in examples like Jezebel's, like the commander's access to black market goods, as well as Serena Joy's access to black market goods. And then finally, thinking about rebellion. So how does rebellion look, and how do people attempt to regain power in this society? And we're going to be thinking particularly of Moira here. Prayer, you want to be thinking about speaking and practicing speaking aloud, pronunciation there. So we've got these ideas already, don't we, as we think about these different lines of argument. So let's organize our ideas into thinking, how does this look in an actual piece of writing? For example, this line of argument, Atwood demonstrates that Gilead's power is reinforced by ubiquitous threats of violence. Here, ubiquitous means it's all around you. Ubi meaning world. So think about it as all around, surrounding you. And these quotations here from the text are going to illustrate this line of argument. So these are different places that you can point to and cite as evidence and analyze as evidence for thinking about how you can support this line of argument here. So power and violence. It's reinforced through violence. And the box in blue at the bottom just here is critical quotation. So if you're thinking about your AO5, your assessment objective 5, and how to include or find critics for your argument, because of course this text was published in the 1980s, so there is less of a body of critical work about The Handmaid's Tale than there is about Shakespeare's Othello, right? Because that's 400 years worth of critical theory. So let's take a look, and I'm going to read these quotations out and just point you to some places that you can think about developing your own lines of argument for coursework as well. This will be really helpful to think about what you can do and how you can attack an idea like power that is so broad in an achievable and clear way. So, firstly, the wall is hundreds of years old too, or over 100 at least. Beside the main gateway there are 6 more bodies hanging, by their necks, their hands tied in front of them, their heads in white bags tipped sideways onto their shoulders. There must have been a men's salvaging early this morning. I didn't hear the bells. Perhaps I've become used to them. The hooks have been set into the brickwork of the wall for this purpose. It is the bags over the heads which are the worse than the faces themselves would be. It makes the men like dolls on which the faces have not yet been painted, like scarecrows, which in a way is what they are, since they are meant to scare. And then smile of blood as well as another part of that quotation. So, thinking about what to say here, and thinking about how to tackle such a big, dense quotation is here and what stands out to us here. Then let's think about a couple of places here I'm going to point out to you with this highlighter. So, firstly, this idea of the wall. Now, of course, this is based in Concord, Massachusetts, or around Concord, Massachusetts. So this wall is in a reference to Harvard University, likely, and their historical significance, the city wall or the university wall. But this idea of history here, of defense protection, is subverted here, is flipped to thinking about it as a demonstration, a place in which public punishments are displayed in order to fearmonger here. And it also shows this idea of the wall as hundreds of years old, is that this violence is being written into history, and perhaps linking this idea of violence, particularly in a place like Concord, Massachusetts, which is linked to the early colonization of what became the United States, thinking about violence as historically linked to power here, and who has power and how it's demonstrated. And then we're thinking about these six more bodies, which suggests that there were bodies pretty continuously, and that this is something that happens as we go through Gilead. And hanging by the necks, this idea that they are not distinguishable here. There's just more bodies, a group of bodies, which suggests a mass execution. Again, thinking of this as not one enemy or an identifiable enemy, but rather as punishing anyone, that there are anyone here could be punished in Gilead. That is how strict and rigid the control is that no one is safe. And this idea of their hands tied in front of them being hanged, a very common form of public execution, particularly used in order to keep control of populations, particularly used for executions. And thinking about their hands tied as well, this idea of powerlessness here as well, of the absolute domination of Gilead as represented by this wall, this powerful image here. And then thinking about their hands being tied before them being so small here and defeated, so really emphasizing the power of Gilead as an idea. And thinking of them with their heads in white bags, so this idea of the cleanness, the purity, purifying Gilead so that only the faithful are remaining and anyone traitorous is taken away. There's an imagery of red and white here already at play. And so interesting because these are the colors that are at play with Offred and the handmaids as well. Then thinking about the men salvaging. Now, these are words we don't know yet because this is early in the text. This is in chapters 3 and 4 is when they go to the market. And the capitalization, again, suggests that this is an event that is commonly known. It's not a shock. She's not shocked to see the bodies here. But also this idea of salvaging is a word that's linked to being saved. So being saved, you would think that someone who's salvaged wouldn't be dead, right? They would be saved. But saving what's left, this idea of saving someone's soul, of saving Gilead, and these are the dregs of that here. Interestingly as well, the idea that there must have been a men salvaging, she didn't hear the bells, perhaps she's become used to them. So this idea of a bell as tolling, again, like a former church bells used to send messages here, but also this idea of reckoning here as well, which leads to this idea of sound being linked to punishment, but also this being a regular occurrence, perhaps similar to the passage of time here. And the fact that she's become used to them, she hasn't even heard them because they're so common. So again, thinking about this ubiquity of violence and punishment, so much so that it's become normalized, they've become accustomed to it. The hooks being set into the wall, it's this idea of inscribing on history, which makes me think of that palimpsest from chapter 1 that we looked at in one of our previous lessons. This idea of being a important place, the purpose being rewritten for a new regime, and drilling these hooks into the wall is a little bit like when they changed the purpose of the school gym to become the Rachel and Leah Center, or when they rewrite the Bible and the teachings or the history as well, when we're talking about the Puritans, when she's looking at the murals, to make them different and usable to justify this new regime. And so thinking about this inscription onto history as well as a form of power that's also being used to justify this violence. The repetition of worst and worse than the faces, the bags over the head, the zooming in on those bags, again, drawing to attention those ideas, as well as the facelessness of the people, and thus the climate of fear, because it's this unknowing, the lack of information, the imagination makes it worse. As we go through this text, Offred is continuously worried about Luke and whether he will appear on the wall. We don't know if he does, and that makes things much more destabilized and much more fearful for Offred as well. Because it's this idea, as we will see with Ofglen as well, of not knowing who people are and not being able to track them down, something that Offred is continuously doing as she returns to the past in her mind to try and find or perhaps rewrite the story of her Luke and her daughter escaping. And this idea of scarecrows, this face that have not yet been painted, it's this idea of Gilead's power again being one that will write the story, write the fate of these people. And later the scarecrows, since they're meant to scare, and this smile of blood being this idea that even harmless things, harmless ideas from the past, even pleasant things, are now unpleasant and meant to inspire fear. So this complete subversion of everything that was innocuous and good now changed to be suspicious and full of fear. With the second quotation, "Nothing safer than dead," said Rita angrily. She was minding her own business. No call to shoot her. "It was an accident," said Cora. "No such thing," said Rita. "Everything is meant." Interestingly here, this is talking about a woman being shot because she was fumbling for her pass in her dress pockets, and the angels thought she was a man with a bomb. Did they actually think this, or is this just something that they made up to justify their violence? We don't know, and we won't. But this idea of violence first, questions later is important here, because even mistakes and misunderstandings lead to death. This intensifies, again, the fear of violence and the fear in general across the text, because the angels and their justification is all that's needed to sweep away this woman's life, and the fact that she was fumbling with her pass is enough justification for her to be killed and shot dead in the street. And this idea that nothing's safer than dead, well, that's actually also true across the text, is that you are constantly unsafe in Gilead, and the only place where they cannot reach you is in death. But even then, as we can see from the scarecrows, your dead body can still be used to inspire fear and promote violence in others. Again, we return to the wall in the third quotation. The three bodies hang there, again, grouped together. This idea of individuality being stripped from the people being punished there, as if any rebellion against Gilead does lead to a stripping even of your humanity. Even with the white sacks over their heads looking curiously stretched, like chickens strung up by the necks in a meat shop window, like birds with their wings clipped, like flightless birds, wrecked angels. Interestingly here, this is talking about women who were put to death here, and thinking of them as chickens, birds with wings clipped, flightless birds, wrecked angels. Here, this kind of mixed metaphor, particularly focusing on these ideas of birds here. Obviously, birds aligned with flying and associated with ideas of flight, autonomy, agency, freedom, independence. But here, the only birds we see, because we have a lot of focus on plants, but not on birds in The Handmaid's Tale, perhaps because there is no inspiration towards freedom in The Handmaid's Tale, is there? Everyone is trapped and controlled and limited here. And interestingly as well, drawing our attention back to meat. We continuously have these little references to meat with Luke, with the commander, with shopping, this idea of meat and importance, meat and luxury, meat and masculinity here. So the women, the dead women here, being on display in a meat shop window, again, perhaps another example of women being used as consumption. So last lesson we looked at we are all honey. This idea of women as consumption, women as display, women as possession here. Because why are birds' wings clipped? So that they can't fly. Remember, Offred's bonnet, her bonnet that controls what she can see, like horse blinders, is called wings as well. So this idea of the demonstration of her wings, but them clipping both her sight and her voice, because she doesn't have her whole ability to see and can only see in gasps, as she says, and also that they can't hear her as well, and creates even a distance between them because, of course, the wings extend quite long out from her face. And flightless birds, we don't need that extra piece of repetition there, but she gives it to us to emphasize this absolute lack of freedom and agency, this powerlessness here. And then wrecked angels. Again, angels linked to flight, to deliverance as well, and protection. That even the women in power, like wives, are also wrecked and destroyed. And perhaps with this theme of religion, as we keep going through The Handmaid's Tale, also thinking about these women as condemned angels, as this idea of the loss of an afterlife and of the perversion of these religious beliefs, because in a theocracy, and particularly in a Christian sect here, it's meant to be that no one in the Bible, thou shalt not kill, right, is one of the commandments, but here that is being done on a very regular basis. So again, exposing the hypocrisy alongside this violence. This here is in the particular that goes towards the end of the novel, and in the time in which Ofglen kicks the man in the head, this is the man, when Aunt Lydia says, "This man," says Aunt Lydia, "has been convicted of rape. I might add that this crime involved 2 of you and took place at gunpoint. It was also brutal. I will not offend your ears with any details, except to say that one woman was pregnant and the baby died." A sigh goes up from us. Despite myself, I feel my hands clench. It is too much, this violation. The baby, too, after what we go through. It's true, there is a bloodlust. I want to tear, gouge, rend. So here then, we see the spreading of this violence and it infecting Offred and the handmaids, even though they themselves are victims of violence and of continuous rape through the ceremonies and through the setup of Gilead, we're also seeing how they themselves become violent under the regime of Gilead. Firstly, thinking of the violence of the rape here as brutal, and so much so that it's caused a death in a way. And this idea of the rape here being considered a kind of violence that Gilead was set up to supposedly leave in the past. And that's one of the justifications for the ceremony and the setup of Gilead, is that it's safe and protecting everyone and women are protected. But the outrage around the rape here does suggest that even in somewhere as closely controlled as Gilead, where angels can't look at handmaids, where the handmaids are covered up so that no one can look at them and they can't tempt anyone, where even language is controlled so it's not tempting, here we can think about this this continuation of violence in a patriarchy, and that men, regardless of society, even in a controlled society like Gilead, will cause the violence to continue here, and that this phallocentric violence is ubiquitous across patriarchal societies. And again, it's catching. So despite myself, I feel my hands clench. Before this, Offred was questioning whether this person was being framed for a crime or not. But this idea of the violation here, and thinking about what it means for a handmaid to lose a baby. A baby, remember, citing the epigraph here, give me children or else I die. Thinking about a baby being the saving grace, ensuring life for a handmaid here. So for her to lose the baby is for her in a way to be killed as well. And as such, we think about Offred's own violence here. It's spreading, infecting her, and thus indicating the cyclicality of violence as well. And thinking about how this violence is very easily spread and stoked in Gilead and in a totalitarian government, so that people are distracted from the violence of the government, and that the government and the patriarchy is continued to be justified here. With this next piece, this is talking about now at the Rachel and Leah Center. They took her, this is Moira, into the room that used to be the science lab. It was a room where none of us ever went willingly. Afterwards, she could not walk for a week. Her feet would not fit into her shoes. They were too swollen. It was the feet they would do for a first offense. They used steel cables frayed at the ends. After that, the hands. They didn't care what they did to your feet or your hands, even if it was permanent. Remember, said Aunt Lydia, for our purposes, your feet and your hands are not essential. Moira lay on her bed, an example. Okay, so Moira here sounding very much like those birds with their wings clipped, the flightless birds, right? Because she similarly has her mode of flight, her feet. Remember, she's trying to escape. That's why she's being punished. Taken away from her. So thinking about these different ideas then, the science lab, firstly, a place where you're meant to discover about life, experiments, has now got a new and perverse purpose. It is where they torture the handmaids who have transgressed in some way. And this idea of no one ever went willingly, that idea of force and a lack of agency here. Again, we're thinking of this shift of place, like with the gymnasiums. We're thinking about setting as indicative of the power of Gilead to rewrite all of these places for us. And thinking about she couldn't walk for a week, her feet. So her feet as, again, symbolic of her agency, her power, her ability to escape being destroyed. And the feet they do for a first offense. So this idea of an escalating ladder, escalating system of violence here, for her to be so brutally tortured for an escape attempt, and this be for the first offense. In our minds, then, we make the conclusions about the escalating violence that will be available to people who commit a second or a third infraction. And terrifyingly brief and fragmented the information we have about what was done. We don't know what happened to Moira. All we know is they used steel cables frayed at the end. It's concludable that they beat her with these steel cables, that they tied her up with these steel cables, that they savaged her feet with these steel cables or mauled them in some way, burnt them, electrocuted them. We don't know, right? And again, that lack of information is actually part of the destabilization of reality, as well as the creation of fear and suspense here. Interestingly, as well, of course, Aunt Lydia says, for our purposes, your hands and feet are not essential. What is their purpose? To make the handmaids walking wombs here. So all extremities that aren't germane to reproduction are unimportant. So the handmaids thus can be amputated, feet, hands, all of that can be destroyed because feet and hands, firstly, fingerprints, secondly, agency, control, humanity are indicative of individuality and agency, and they don't matter to the handmaids at all. No, sorry, to the aunts at all, and they don't matter to the handmaid's purpose, which is just to be able to have a baby, and that's it. And interestingly, Moira lay on her bed, an example. So again, like with the wall, the visibility of Moira here is important because it shows the consequences for defying Gilead. And the aunts, of course, are a metonym for the power of Gilead as well. And this idea of her laying on her bed, she can't walk, so all she can do is lay on her bed. And really, isn't that the role that the handmaids are taking on in Gilead, is to lay in bed here because A, they're getting impregnated, and B, they are holding a baby and giving birth. So this idea that they have no role, and so that in punishing her, they've made her more the person, or rather the thing they want her to be, which is an object that can lie there and submit to the impregnation and the giving birth of a baby for someone else passively. The passivity is important here. This is with the angels later. If they think of a kiss, they must then immediately think of the floodlights going on, the rifle shots. So this is Offred trying to think about what these young angels that they pass at a checkpoint when they're going to the market are thinking about here. And this idea of if they think of a kiss, this idea of sexuality or desire, even an innocent one, some kind of affection, desire, physical touch, being linked to and causing directly punishment, violence, and death. And this idea of the thought of a kiss causing these following thoughts, thinks of how deeply embedded this indoctrination has happened even in the early years of Gilead. So then everything, even innocence, is linked to punishment and death. This next quotation is from the doctor, saying, he takes his hand away lazily, almost lingeringly. This is not the last word as far as he's concerned. He could fake the tests, report me for cancer, for infertility, have me shipped off to the colonies with the unwomen. None of this has been said, but the knowledge of his power hangs nevertheless in the air as he pats my thigh, withdrew himself behind the hanging sheet. Okay, a couple of pieces here. This is the doctor who is transgressive because, firstly, sexually harasses Offred and presumably other handmaids as well, based on the part of this the text is from, and offers to impregnate her now so that she can have a baby. So is essentially offering his services because he wants to have sex with her and knows that this will help Hello, Subra. Thank you for joining us. And this idea of impunity with him, that he can touch and transgress these rules because he has power. He can do any of these things if he wants to. If, for example, she, who has just said no thank you to the offer of forced, coerced impregnation, he has the ability to essentially dehumanize her, to negate her humanity entirely, because he can say whatever he wants, and as we find out, it takes two women's testimony to counteract one man's. So this idea that he knows he has at least double the power of hers as a doctor as well, he has even more power. And this idea that through his profession, through science, he's able to justify and preserve the violence of the patriarchy as well. He's protected by his power, and it allows him, in fact, validates him committing violence here. And the knowledge of his power, he doesn't have to say it. Everyone knows, both of them know, that it hangs, nevertheless, in the air behind the hanging sheet. Notice as well this idea of hanging here that echoes in the background. You might not even have noticed it. This idea of hanging, they could have used a different word, right? We could have used a different word, but I think it's resonant of the hanging bodies on the wall, the hangings that we see across the text. Because here it's this idea of power and punishment as one. Even Moira eventually gets this idea when Offred meets her at Jezebel's and says, well, you have 3 or 4 years before your snatch wears out and they send you to the boneyard. So this idea of the sex workers at Jezebel's, including Moira, in a way are being punished because they are forced into sex work at this brothel, Jezebel's, for the commanders. And this is partly because they've been punished. They can't even be made handmaids, they can't be made wives, they can't be made daughters, but they can be used literally, bodily, and for sexual purposes of commanders who have enough power not only to enact and create these rules of Gilead, but also to defy them in a safe way for them. And as soon as they tire of the usage of these women's bodies, they can send them to the colonies, the boneyard, so literally send them to the grave. And it's unclear whether Moira means that they actually shoot them or execute them, or if they send them to the colonies, which is essentially a death sentence, and make them unwomen as well. So then, thinking about the violence and the vulgarity of how Moira is talking about women's bodies here with your snatch wears out, so literally the usage of a woman's body by the commanders here. And the idea of the boneyards, this idea of you're already dead in a way in society, and this is a one-way trip. So this idea of lack of agency, there's no choice here, but there is an idea of no longer being usable or good enough, but this idea of productivity, enjoyability, safety for the commanders in this world in which women know that they're disposable, not only at Jezebel's, but also the handmaids, the wives, the Marthas, any women. And this is clear, particularly in the final quotation here. There were incidents in bathrooms at first. There were cuttings, drownings, before they got all the bugs ironed out. So describing clearly a spate or a trend of deaths in bathrooms by women, particularly handmaids, or particularly between handmaids and wives, that's been reduced to incidents. This is obscure language, obfuscatory language, unclear language that magnifies the violence of this as well. That there is so much violence in Gilead that people are inured to it. And there were cuttings, drownings, again, blurring that line between self-inflicted harm and murder, but that it doesn't really matter because that was all part of the experiment for the bugs being ironed out. So very similar to the way that the commander speaks. And he says, you know, the better isn't better for everyone. For some people, it's worse. It's this idea of the means to an end, or something needs to give or be sacrificed for the sake of others, and that this is the bugs being ironed out. So even in Offred's language and Offred's thinking about this, we can see this idea of violence as normalized, and even this callous approach to violence, because it seems like these lives are somewhat immaterial to the people in Gilead at the time. Bloom says about The Handmaid's Tale that her Gilead is a vampiric realm, a society sick with blood. So this idea of Gilead being vampiric, so being vampire-like in either way, so sucking on blood, being nourished by blood, and thus thinking about this is a really good way to support this idea of violence sustaining Gilead, protecting it, cementing its practices, and ensuring it continues for hundreds of years, as evident in the historical notes. Ehrenreich says that Gilead is a fortress of patriarchy. So this idea then of violence being used to protect this fortress of patriarchy, being used as lines of defense to ensure that patriarchy is continued. The doctor, the commanders here, the angels here being ways of doing that. And then Wagner Martin, the novel is a prediction of the horror of cultures so frightened by normal sexuality it has codified and prescribed all such procreation and created hierarchies of life and death around it. So thinking about sexuality as a life and death experience here, and particularly thinking about it in terms of life, so the ceremony, etc., and give me children else I die, and also of death, of the transgressions being linked to sexuality or reproduction. We hear that the bodies are adultery, perhaps, or abortion related, etc., and then the punishments being linked as well to when you are not fulfilling your role as a woman in this society. Another line of argument here is thinking more particularly about the commander, so focusing a paragraph on the commander rather than more broadly across the violence in Gilead, because the commander himself is not an ostensibly violent man in his actions in private. We don't really know his role in Gilead. The historical notes suggests one of two, and it seems that he perhaps was a cause of quite a lot of violence and punishment, perhaps inventing the partisecutions, but he doesn't do anybody. He doesn't slap Offred or even appear to want to the way that Serena Joy does. He doesn't actually do any of the partisecutions or kill anyone. But still, his power is clear, and he is a metonym for the power in society. So he's a part that represents the whole of the power that men have in society, because he's a really good example of it. For example, the fact that Offred cannot get pregnant, and this is her third placement, suggests that some of these men who, with this disease they were exposed to, are thought to be sterile, is being blamed and is on her last chance, even though it's likely that the commander, even Serena Joy thinks, is sterile. But there is no such thing as a sterile man anymore, not officially. There are only women who are fruitful and women who are barren. That's the law. So this idea then of power being linked to blame, because men use their power to escape any blame or culpability for this spate of infertility here, and use science and law, two elements of power in society, in order to ensure their protection and their power. So they are untouchable in terms of fertility. And it is women's role here to have a baby, and it's their job. So there's also this bifurcation between the two kinds of women, fruitful and barren, which again lays this blame in a very similar way to the Madonna whore dichotomy, right, of good women and bad women here in society. And that men are protected from all of that. There is no distinguishing between good and bad, because thus men are viewed as intrinsically good, intrinsically correct, and protected here. Now, is this a patriarchy where men made these rules? Absolutely. And of course, they have used different institutions of society in order to preserve their power by ensuring they're not blamed for not having any children. In the second quotation, this becomes even more clear. The commander is the head of the household. The house is what he holds. To have and to hold until death do us part. The hold of a ship, hollow. Such an interesting quotation here, because we're playing with such familiar language. The head of household is a common phrase, but here it takes on new and even more powerful meaning. The head of household means that he's in control. The house is what he holds. So thus that his power is in his possession. And his possession isn't just the house, but everything within the house. The wife, the driver, the Marthas, and of course Offred and Offred's body. She is lumped in with these possessions. And interestingly, from there, we think to have and to hold till death do us part. Where do we know that language from? We know it from marriage vows, right? And thinking about these marriage vows as linked to control and power, because this language of marriage thus reveals the control of men in the patriarchy. Because this language we don't think about, but in Offred subverting and transferring the use of this very common language for us into Gilead, we have these ideas of patriarchy sneaking into and infecting again control, and that this language of a husband and wife, or of marriage more broadly, exposing that this is not new. This is patriarchy, that within marriages today and marriages in society historically and traditionally, men did have all of this power. Remember, it was only 1974 where women were able to have a credit card. Before that, they were only allowed to have one in their husband's name. They weren't allowed to open their own. It's this idea of control till death do us part. So then linking marriage and this power of patriarchy to death and the continuity of this power up until death. And then the hold of a ship. Hold of a ship is the storage room, right, where things are held, hollow. Then we're thinking about Offred, aren't we? That he holds her, but what is she here? She describes herself often as empty, and in the first quotation as well, barren, also a word for emptiness, right? So thinking then about herself as this vessel for him to fill with his possessions, i.e. with his children. And this hollowness, thinking of her as empty, remember she is absolutely on her last chance to have a baby because this is her third placement. But interestingly, we could think about this differently as well, thinking about, is it her who's hollow, and thus she's thinking about her emptiness here, and the fact that he owns her as another possession that he gets to use as he likes? Or is it thinking about his power as hollow and his power as being the hold of a ship that's empty, because she, in thinking this way, perhaps is resisting him, and that he can't control her mind. He doesn't know her real name. She can preserve some pieces for her, and his power may be real in society, but in some way she manages to keep something for herself, and thus it's revealed that his power is only superficial. Interesting, the grammatical construction here as well, thinking about the short sentences here, really reinforcing the rigidity, the firmness, the untouchability of the power of the commander as well. And it's clear a lot of the time in the short sentences, they are in the passages about the commander. In the same place, when we're talking about the household, the Bible is kept locked up. It's an incendiary device. Who knows what we'd make of it if we ever got our hands on it? We can be read to from it by him, but we cannot read. And here we see the hypocrisy of Gilead, because the Bible, the text on which supposedly Gilead is based, is restricted only to some. And that is because the Bible is meant to be a text linked to personal faith, that one's personal beliefs can leave room for interpretation. And different sects of Christianity and different people have interpreted the Bible differently. Obviously, we know this. But then this magnifies this real idea for us into the power of a text that can be interpreted, because it means you can have your own personal opinion. Gilead is not about personal opinions, but about rigidity and control. And the fact that the Bible is locked up means it is something powerful and dangerous, and reinforces these ideas of imprisonment and freedom that have been carrying on across the text. But also, if it's locked up, that means that only the commander has access to it, which means that only people like the commander can tell everyone else what it says. And Offred knows this because she knows that there are parts of the Bible that Gilead indoctrination have changed, like blessed be the silent, which is not a beatitude, but has been changed in order to enforce their regime. Apologies, my screens are just flickering, saying I need to restart them. So I'm still talking, but bear with me for 1 second. There we are. Okay, should be good going forwards, team. So, thinking about this as then an incendiary device, and that some people have control of it and some people do not. And this power dynamic is one way and extremely unbalanced, because the commander can read from it, but they can't read it. And remember, the handmaids and all women are not meant to be able to read anymore. So that doubles their powerlessness in this position, because not only can they not check for themselves, but they also have no way of being able to read it for themselves either, because it's locked away and they won't be able to read. Offred can read because she was an adult before the regime took place, but the children, like her daughter, who was only 4 or 5 when they were separated, perhaps can't read or can't read anymore, because that would be antithetical to the ability to control people. This is part of mind control. Remember, information is power. So lack of information, restriction of information means only some people have that power. And it's interesting that we think about incendiary devices and hands here. Hands, symbolic of agency and power and control, individual control, and also identity, right? Like fingerprints. And then an incendiary device is like a bomb, right? Something that lights on fire. So a Bible being explosive because it is dangerous here as well. And very much linked to when Moira says there's a bomb in Gilead, right? So this idea of the language, the teachings of Gilead inspiring their own resistance and rebellion by creating so much restriction that people do resist. This incendiary household, thinking about the Bible as dangerous and books thus as dangerous as well. We know this because the books that the commander has are shocking to Offred. As well, Offred needs to think in the fact that she's challenging the commander in these meeting she has with him. For him, I must remember I am only a whim. So the idea that she is disposable to him. There is a power dynamic again here, and he is only interested in her currently. That doesn't mean she's protected forever, and he retains the power over her to stop talking to her and to get rid of her and frame her for something even whenever it is he decides that she is no longer interesting to him or that he wants her. We can see this at the end of the novel when he's already retreating into himself, when she is being taken away by the eyes. He doesn't do anything. And when Serena Joy is confronting her, he doesn't do anything. But even earlier from this, we think about the fact that he didn't or couldn't do anything to save the previous handmaid who committed suicide in Offred's room. And also the disposability of someone like the Doctor, who is also able to use his power to get rid of something that challenges him too much. Ofglen reinforces this, saying he's way up there, says Ofglen. He's at the top, and I mean the very top. So this idea of power and control being linked to height as well. We often, in the ceremony in particular, we see the commander as above Offred. So this idea of physical distance and space and dynamic being reinforced by the power dynamic between them as well. This is Moira then talking about the commanders and their hypocrisy. Some of them do that. They get a kick out of it. It's like screwing on the altar or something. Your gang is supposed to be such chaste vessels. They like to see you all painted up. Just another crummy power trip. So this idea of women like Offred, handmaids, being taken to Jezebels in costumes that are like burlesque dancers or something from the past, thinking about them as just a medium for entertainment for men to fulfill some kind of fetish, that these women are being used to show off or to get what men want from them, and that it is like the commanders are defiling something religious, which they are in a way because they made these rules about religion and sex and control in making Gilead. Remember, the commander is meant to be responsible for some of the laws and the enforcements of Gilead, but he is willing to defile and corrupt them, especially the handmaids, because they've made them into these idealized figures of Madonna, of the perfect receptacle of a womb, but the idea that they want to defile the handmaids just as much. So they force them to be pure and then take their power in order to defile them for themselves. So this idea of marking, controlling, soiling the handmaids as well, that interplays really nicely and interestingly with the themes of purity across the novel. And that this is totally hypocritical, right? This is all about power and nothing about the women having any kind of enjoyment of this as well. This is just using women as props to have a fun time for them. or all about getting what the commanders want. We've looked at this next quote before. He's stroking my body now. This is at Jezebel's again, when he wants to have sex with her, not in the way ascribed by the ceremony. And from stern to stern, cat stroke along the left flank, down the left leg. He stops at the foot, his fingers encircling the ankle briefly like a bracelet where there's tattoo is. Like a braille he can read, a castle brand. It means ownership. This idea of her being described as in boat language of stern, for example, cat stroke as well. So traditional shes, boats and cats both linked with femininity, but also possession and dehumanization. And then he stops at the foot, his fingers encircling the ankle. We've seen this before, that this becomes, if this is an ankle, a kind of manacle or handcuff around her ankle, a shackle that links his attraction, this transgressive sex that he wants, with ownership, with possession and dehumanization, because it is as a result of him and the other commanders that she has a tattoo on her ankle that indicates her who owns her, which is him. So he is enjoying sexually the fact that he owns her and he can do what he wants to her. And a braille he can read, this idea of reinforcing and really shoving in our faces the levels of power he has over her. And then a castle brand, this idea of being burnt into her skin, something permanent of his ownership over her, and that he is enjoying this. In the justification for Jezebel's, he says, we don't have different clothes, you merely have different women. So this idea of the exchangeability of women and clothes here, rather than having these dress-up costumes that Offred wears to Jezebel's, they have a handmaid for sex and procreation, they have a wife for the emotional support bits, they have Marthas for cooking. So this separation of different roles of womanhood, and different women fulfill only these one pieces. So women then are reduced to their roles. They're not 3D complex human figures, but rather just different elements serving what men want. Offred says as well, men at the top have always had mistresses. Why should things be any different now? So this idea of the continuity of powerful men and control over women. The hypocrisy, the irony of this, and the fact that rulers always make exceptions for themselves. So this idea that the commanders are going to take mistresses because they have the power to, even if they're enforcing death for adultery on the other hand. When Offred confronts ideas of the commanders, he says, why? Talking about the lotion that he says that she tells him she can't have because the wives didn't want them to have it. Why, he asks, as if he didn't really know. Maybe he didn't. It wasn't the first time he gave evidence of being truly ignorant of the real conditions under which we lived. So he is surprised that, for example, they're not given hand cream, or they don't have shoelaces, those kinds of small things here. And the idea of, again, ignorance, even in his position, speaks to the idea of him not considering her and the reality of Gilead because he is so protected from it. He doesn't have any suffering as a result of Gilead. His life is pretty much the same. He goes to work, he has a wife. Other than the ceremony and the superficial things and performances he needs to give as a commander in Gilead, he is not affected by it in the same way. He hasn't lost anything, in other words, or at least nothing that he can't have if he wants to, like magazines and Scrabble, etc. And when he gives her lotion, he watched me smoothing it over my hands and then my face with the same air of looking in through the bars. So this idea then of voyeurism, which is very evident in the Jezebel scene, but also in the Scrabble scenes, where he likes watching her and he likes giving her things to see her reaction because she interests him, but not in a way of a human to human connection, but rather because to him he's examining her. He's using her as a kind of curiosity here that is dehumanizing and voyeuristic. And when he gives her things as well, staring at the magazine as he dangled it before me like fish bait, I wanted it. The real promise in them was immortality. That was what he was holding without knowing it. So this idea that if he has access to things like magazines, which she doesn't say that she enjoyed beforehand, as a matter of fact, she thought of them as rather desultory in her previous life, but the fact that he has access to immortality, to power, because he has access to information and thus to life itself, and he dangles it in front of her like fish bait. Again, it's sick, isn't it? Of thinking of him as delight in having this power and withholding it from her, and having it and being able to give it to her, this performativity of it as well. Hello, Naima. Thank you for joining us. And then finally, we thought we could do better. Better never means better for everyone, he says. It always means worse for some. So this hubris of we thought we could do better than the human condition. She thought of things like love in offering evidence as to why the commander's vision for things doesn't work. He thinks he could do better, make a better world. But to us it sounds hubristic, it sounds arrogant, ignorant, especially if he doesn't even know what's actually going on in Gilead. And then his real priority is better never means best for everyone. It always means worse for some, which means that he knows that it's worse for some people. But because he's protected, because he's one of the people it's better for, he doesn't care. Interestingly as well, we've got figures like Serena Joy as a wife. Her superior and harshly wielded position reveals the inherent power struggles here. So though she is oppressed in a way, she is also not, because she is not forced to undergo the same suffering and experiences that Offred or the handmaids are. So here, for example, my arms are raised, she holds my hands, one of mine in each of hers. So she's holding the power, in other words. This is supposed to signify that we are one flesh, one being. Religious language here, but what it really means is that she is in control of the process and thus of the product, if any. The rings of her left hand cut into my fingers. It may or may not be revenge. Interestingly, those rings, left hand, wedding ring, and engagement ring, presumably, cutting into her hand. So Serena Joy does not like the ceremony at all, and is taking out that on the handmaid, who has no power in this situation, right? So thinking about this as her violence and hurting and controlling Offred in order to remind her of her dominant position. The same in the next one. If I'm caught, it's to Serena's tender mercies I'll be delivered. Again, religious language. Deliver us from every evil. Deliver us from sin, etc. So she will be delivered to Serena's tender mercies. That's ironic. Obviously, she knows it's not going to be tender. It's going to be cruel and vicious. He, the commander, isn't supposed to meddle in such household discipline. That's women's business. So again, household discipline, that's Serena Joy's wheelhouse, because of course this is the domestic sphere, traditional position for women. After that, reclassification. I could become an unwoman, but to refuse to see him could be worse. There's no doubt about who holds the real power. So this is when she's deciding whether or not she goes to see the commander in the study. And consequently, she could be completely dehumanized. She'd become an unwoman, which is basically being dead because it's being sent to the colonies. And though she knows that her life hangs in Serena Joy's balance, refusing a man is way worse than refusing a wife because they still have a closer relationship in terms of the power they have than a handmaid and a commander. Where does this power come from? Well, the sitting room is subdued, symmetrical. It's one of those shapes money takes when it freezes. Money has trickled through this room for years and years, as if through an underground cavern, crusting and hardening like stalactites. So this idea of thinking about money as part of Serena Joy's power, her status as an upper class woman. Remember, working class women are econo wives, not wives. So it is money that is ensured that she stays in power even in this regime. And that speaks to class in The Handmaid's Tale, doesn't it? Because though Offred and Serena Joy are both women, their experience is very different. And thus we can read this in an intersectional feminist lens, because we can show that women don't have the same experience just because they're women. We can see that money creates a hardness and control that's symmetrical. The shape money takes, harden, crusted. Thinking about this as a rigid form of power that is made permanent through Gilead and beforehand. So Serena Joy has maintained power across regimes because she's upper class. She probably longed to slap my face. They can hit us. There's scriptural precedent, which means that they're relying on the Bible for laws and precedents for how wives can treat handmaids. She wants to use violence to do that. She wants to hit her. And the idea that this is reinforced, she is empowered to violence against the handmaids because it's in the Bible, speaks to this link of power and religion as important and being used to maintain the power dynamics at play here. The commander knocks at the door. The knock is prescribed. The sitting room is meant to be, or is supposed to be, Serena Joy's territory. He's supposed to ask permission to enter it. She likes to keep him waiting. It's a little thing, but in this household, little things mean a lot. So this idea of the little power trip that Serena Joy does every time there's a ceremony or every time there's household, because the sitting room, that's her territory, which again thinks of these ideas of predator and prey and control here, power, and this idea of knocking, asking permission. Now we know that this is all a little bit perfunctory because the commander can do whatever he wants. It's his house. She doesn't have any real power. But she does get these little twists of power when she can, which again perhaps is why the commander seeks out a relationship with Offred, because he and Serena Joy are consistently locked in these power struggles. But this resistance, even Serena Joy, in a way, resists the powers of Gilead, as indicated by the commander. And she does this in different ways. The cigarettes, a thing of power for Offred, who smoked before the Gilead regime made it illegal for handmaids to smoke, must have come from the black market. So that means that Serena Joy has access to illicit forms of power as well, and that her money gives her more power, gives her the power to transgress these places in society. The same way that Nick, even though he's not as powerful as the commander, because he's a man, he is able to take some liberties like smoking and winking and things. It's the same with Serena Joy because she's an upper class white woman. As for my husband, she says, he's just that, my husband. I want that to be perfectly clear. So the idea of control then, power, and this being linked to possession and wifedom. So her and marriage as giving her power, and because Offred's marriage was dissolved in Gilead, that means that she has no power. So this is really harkening back to traditional gender expectations and power dynamics. Interestingly as well, something that people often don't pick up. She fits the skein of wool over my two outstretched hands, starts winding. I am leashed, it looks like, manacled, cobwebbed. That's closer. So Serena Joy asks her to help with the knitting. They're sitting under the tree. This is when she decides to tell Offred that she wants her to have sex with Nick so that they can have a baby. Because she says, I think he's sterile, the commander. But in asking to help her wind the wool, and remember Serena Joy is arthritic, her hands in particular are very sore and stiff. So this idea of calcified power, or limited agency, limited movement, speaks to this idea that her hands physically are stiff and sore and swollen and painful, perhaps because she's complicit in creating Gilead. Remember, she was the singer, advocating for Gilead, but also the idea that she does have some power still because she's able to do things like knit. And she's able to wind the wool around Offred's hands so that she becomes manacled, metaphorically, right? That Serena Joy is showing her power to Offred here by literally manacling her, tying her hands. Talking about Serena Joy's past, her speeches were about the sanctity of the home, about how women should stay home. Serena Joy didn't do this herself. She made speeches instead, but she presented this failure of hers as a sacrifice she was committing for the good of all. So, firstly, hypocrisy. But secondly, this idea that this is partly her fault, and thus that she is complicit in taking power from any woman who is not like her. She managed to preserve herself. And they said, the wives, this is something we fought for. So the idea that there were no losing power for wives in Gilead, they maintained some kind of status and protection of their way of life, was because she was trying to preserve the lives of women like her. So her being very much a particular form of womanhood and femininity that enacts punishment on others who are unlike her. She doesn't make speeches anymore. She has become speechless. She stays in her home, but it doesn't seem to agree with her. How furious she must be now that she's been taken at her word. And that taken at her word means listened to, right? But also taken at her word. It's introducing these ideas of speechlessness as well, and thinking of her being speechless and having her voice, which she used to advocate for the oppression of women, has now led to her own oppression as well. And the irony of that she has as well become speechless. And that this was a decree of the wives. This is a more broad issue, this absence of hand lotion. They don't want us to look attractive. For them, things are bad enough as it is. So this idea of wives being able to decree things, that they have some kind of power to take things away from people below them, speaks to these inherent power struggles as well, to ensure oppression of those below. Then to put her out of her misery, and myself as well, to put her out of our misery. These are in the final pages when Offred is considering what she should do to Serena Joy when thinking about being captured, thinking about, should I knock her out or knock her down the stairs? And this idea of the fact that Serena Joy does have power, but she is similarly trapped in this hideous oppression of Gilead. And Goldblatt says the work women do conspires to maintain the oppression of their own kind. So thinking about Serena Joy working in a way that leads to the oppression of every woman, including herself. Then thinking about the aunts here. Atwood's presentation of the aunts suggests conservative women's complicity in female oppression. So taking this even further and looking at it with the aunts who patrol, who have electric cattle prods slung on thongs from their leather belts. This idea of punishment and violence here linked to these aunt figures. Aunt be a sort of endearing term that's juxtaposed with their violent treatment of the handmaids. Aunt Lydia thought she was very good at feeling for other people. Try to pity them, forgive them, for they know not what they do. It was a bad idea to rustle or fidget during these pauses. Aunt Lydia might look abstracted, but she was aware of every twitch. So interestingly, forgive them for they know not what they do is Jesus's language on the cross to God. So Aunt Lydia, then using this language, thinks of her as this kind of divine figure, but also a hypocritical one, because she is so unempathetic, so unsympathetic as a character, and constructed in such a way that this seems hideously complicit to the handmaid's oppression here. And this aware of every twitch, this idea of control, the omniscience of this godlike figure, not one to love, but one that punishes, like an Old Testament kind of God. Aunt Lydia also talking about men being sex machines and learning how to manipulate them. This is her saying, Aunt Lydia did not actually say this, but it was implicit in everything she did say. It hovered over her head like the golden mottos of the saints of the darker ages. Like them too, she was angular and without flesh. So this idea of her being then likened to saints and her being a martyr for the cause, but also her being giving instructions, but the language being twisted here, and her being deified as this kind of perfect woman who is powerful in this society. And how powerful? For every rule, there's always an exception. This too can be depended on. The aunts are allowed to read and write. So they're talking to the handmaids about how reading and writing is temptation and evil, but they can read and write. Hypocrisy there in this system. Aunt Lydia rummages in her pocket, produces a crumpled piece of paper. This she takes an undue length of time to unfold and scan. She's rubbing our noses in it, letting us know exactly who she is, making us watch her as she silently reads, flaunting her prerogative. Obscene, I think. Now, is this obscenity her showing off so much her power in contrast to the handmaids? Or is Offred also internalizing this idea of women reading being obscene? This idea of really showboating her power here as important to showing this difference between handmaids and aunts. This as well for ensuring how they maintain this system of power. Her fault, her fault, her fault, we chant in unison. Who led them all on? Aunt Helena beams, pleased with us. She did, she did, she did. So thinking of them as the aunts as empowered, in control, enjoying even their control and their teaching of the handmaids, but thinking of them as mobilizing, indoctrinating the handmaids to rethink things like, as we will see, this being a gang rape at 14 and subsequent abortion. So thinking about them as teaching the handmaids to blame women for their own violent assault. And look at the punishments. Yesterday, Dolores wet the floor. 2 aunts hauled her away, a hand under each armpit. She wasn't there for the afternoon walk, but at night she was back in her usual bed. All night we could hear her moaning, on and off. Off and on, apologies. Demonstrating their power here, again, like with the previous quotation, but also thinking of the infantilization of Dolores, because they're not letting her go to the toilet when she needs to. She's so desperate she wets herself. So really reducing the handmaids to a kind of child figure and then punishing them for it. And again, that punishment being something that's restricting Dolores to her bed. So again, enforcing that passivity there and punishment and torture. And we've seen this already, this quotation, the feet. For our purposes, your feet and your hands aren't essential. This permanent damage by the aunts to the handmaids. The complicity continuing when the aunts, Aunt Lydia in particular, are at the potter's execution. But you may stand up and form a circle. She smiles down upon us, generous, munificent. She's about to give us something, bestow, orderly now. It's this idea of her again in this divine figure, giving like a god to the other handmaids, but in doing so, in assuring this cycle of violence of Gilead, because she's going to use them to execute someone. That's what the handmaids are used for in a persecution here. Hello, Ayara. Thank you for joining. And then in the historical notes, seeing this again, by becoming aunts, women were able to escape redundancy and consequent shipment to the infamous colonies. So this idea that, okay, perhaps women who become aunts are complicit in oppression, but perhaps this is also because otherwise they would be unwomen. They're too old to become handmaids or wives. So they are able to retain a kind of power by becoming complicit to female oppression. And the historical notes also note, when power is scarce, a little of it is tempting. So thinking about the writer's intention of Atwood about the aunts here, thinking about complicity, control, power trips, and the slippery slope of power and absolute power corrupting absolutely here. Malak says Aunt Lydia functions ironically as the spokesperson of anti-feminism. She urges the handmaids to renounce themselves and become non-persons. So literally dehumanize themselves. Brooks Boson says that the aunts uphold the male supremacist power structure of Gilead with its hierarchical arrangement of the sexes, and they play an active role in the state's sexual enslavement of the handmaids, female-directed oppression of women. So thus, Brooks Boson, in a way, is blaming women for their own oppression and blaming the aunts as leading on this oppression. Now, we can argue whether that is fair or unfair in a patriarchal society like Gilead, but certainly we're thinking about the aunts as having some kind of complicity in this system. And Goldblack saying the work women do conspires to maintain the subjection of their own kind. Again, we've seen this already, but the idea of this being a cycle of violence and oppression that will carry on. Then let's think of the motif of the eyes across the novel to foreground the use of constant surveillance as a method of retaining power over a populace. Because here we're thinking about being seen and seeing as surveillance and thus as power, because it's a way of controlling here. And this is evident throughout the novel. On the white ceiling, a relief ornament. In the center, a blank space, plastered over, like the place in a face where the eye has been taken out. So already something being marred and destroyed here, something missing here. And thinking about this as some kind of damage. Remember that in this room, the reason that things have been plastered over is because the last handmaid committed suicide using the fan that was hanging from the ceiling and hanged herself from it. So this idea of that woman being able to escape, but this omnipresent eye here being continuously plaguing Offred and watching her. Then above us, I know there are floodlights attached to telephone poles for use in emergencies. There are men with machine guns in the pillboxes on either side of the road. I don't see the floodlights and the pillboxes because of the wings around my face. I just know that they're there. So there we're seeing the control and the power of sight and seeing, because it's linked to violence, but we all have this kind of panopticon of vision and surveillance here. A panopticon is a kind of prison structure. If you look it up, it's really interesting to think about, but one in which there is a central guard post and the cells form a ring around it so that continue with a open to the air, so you can see it from wherever you are. So this idea of control coming from the fact that you're always being seen and thus your behavior is controlled. It's also linked to violence, right? Men with machine guns. But also this omnipresence is unsettling because Offred doesn't know where they are and so can't escape them or ever feel like away from them. Then, of course, we have the eyes of God, the spies here. The winged eye in white on the side. The windows of the van are dark tinted. The men in the front seats wear dark glasses, a double obscurity. The vans are surely more silent than the other cars. When they pass, we avert our eyes. If there are sounds coming from inside, we try not to hear them. So here then, seeing and being seen is different. And the eyes are protected from sight and also don't or can't, no one can see what they're looking at. So they act with a kind of impunity in society as well. But we get the impression that they're looking at everyone. And they are not looked at. So this idea that they are above suspicion or above judgment, and that the handmaids are not, and that they escape even if they're a sign and it sounds like people are being tortured or even killed in the eyes vans at some points. But this is all normalized and allowed to happen as a result of this fear mongering that they're doing. Again, with the white wings we talked about earlier, they're prescribed issue, which means there's language there about assignment, about martial law there, as well as medicinal in a way, and then keep us from seeing, but also being seen. So again, control here. Complicity, blindness, because they are doubly blind. In a way, the double obscurity is that the eyes are doubly protected, but then the fact that they can't see or be seen suggests that they are doubly blind, like horses, because with blinders, because they are only used for breeding, in a way, like horses are, right? Like animals. And this is Nick. Then he winks again. He doesn't do some other sign. He winks. So this idea of knowledge, eye, connection, etc. I drop my head and turn so that the white wings hide my face. Perhaps it was a test to see what I would do. Perhaps he's an eye. So this idea of the subversive behavior. Is this lust? Is this that he sees and recognizes her as a human and sort of acknowledges her humanity? Is it that he is trying to expose someone who is unfaithful to Gilead? And this fact that he's a spy or that he's hiding something and that Offred is also trying to hide from him creates this sense of doubt that permeates the Handmaid's Tale as well. Then, under his eye, she says, the right farewell. Under his eye, I reply. So these are the greetings and farewells here in Gilead, which also link to this idea of the reminder of his eye. Now, of course, this is meant to be God's eye, but his eye is particularly indicative, right? This idea of them always being watched, even in their language, there's a complete lack of freedom. And this idea that the patriarchy, it's like Big Brother is watching them, right? This indefinable society is watching them. It's not just God. And it's interesting they don't say God's eye, right? They say his eye. Then, here looking at a quotation about the commander, his tentacle, his delicate stalked slug's eye, avid for vision, to achieve vision in this way, this journey into a darkness that is composed of women, a woman who can see in darkness while he himself strains blindly forwards. So this is talking about the commander having sex with Ofra during the ceremony here. And his idea that to be seen, as Aunt Lydia says, is to be penetrated. So this way that men look at women can be a form of violence, but also this idea of eyes and penises being linked here, probing this darkness as this way of almost that he is looking within her here. He can even see inside her because of the fact that they are having sex in this place of Gilead. But interestingly, this women being associated with darkness and women being able to see in the darkness, whereas men can't. So this idea of even if he is attempting to see her and know her in biblical way, he can't. And she still has something apart from him, because even if he is having sex with her, controlling her, owning her in Gilead, he doesn't have access to her thoughts and her inner self. The eyes, again, returning to them, with the two eyes in grey suits, leap from the opening double doors at the back. They grab a man who is walking along, a man with a briefcase, an ordinary looking man, slam him back against the black side of the van. He's there a moment, splayed out against the metal as if stuck to it. Then one of the eyes moves in on him, does something sharp and brutal that doubles him over into a limp cloth bundle. They pick him up and heave him into the back of the van like a sack of mail. So their eyes linked to violence. And the eyes, of course, the eyes of God, as we can see here as well, run all over the earth. And this then coming from this failed escape attempt. So this is when Offred is talking about when she tried to escape with Luke and her daughter, and that they were betrayed and sold out by someone who sold information, presumably. There's eyes of God, and the eyes of God who do this violent act as well. In the last quotation we just looked at, this idea of constant surveillance, no one is safe, this godlike power to literally, presumably, either kill or maim someone on the street and get away with it entirely, because they have this omnipotent kind of access to society and can do whatever they want for information and punishment, and run all over the earth, omnipresent as well as omniscient and omnipotent. And again, the semi-dark. I stare up at the blind plaster eye in the middle of the ceiling, which stares back down at me even though it can't see. So again, the unescapable eye here, that even in her room alone, she feels like she's being watched. It's still there, and she's perhaps not even safe in her own head, but she stares back at it as well. So maybe this little bit of resistance here. And then here, in this final quotation here, soothing to the eye, the eyes, the eyes. That's who this show is for. This is when the handmaids are walking in their perfect lines. They're described as like a Dutch frieze or Dutch wallpaper, but also it seems kind of like a chain gang or a school group where they're all divided in perfect lines. So this idea of infantilization, control, imprisonment, to demonstrate how obedient and pious we are, they say later on in this extract, and to show that the women's behavior here is a performance for men, that they're doing it for the people watching, and that those people are always watching, and that the repetition of eyes even indicates that on the linear level. Brooks Boson says that the hostile male gaze that objectifies and obliterates what it sees becomes figured in the omnipresent eyes, the eyes of God, who are agents of this of surveillance and oppression. If to be seen, as Rennie recognizes in bodily harm, is to be violated, interesting, to be seen is to be violated, perhaps the language of Gilead, the enforced invisibility of the handmaid serves as an even more insidious threat to the self. Modesty is invisibility. To be seen is to be penetrated. What you must be, girls, is impenetrable, the handmaids are taught. As the handmaids walk in pairs, twin-like, they are iterable objects in the eyes of the body politic. So they become objects, pieces of something here that are controllable and watchable. And Bowen says every step, every mouthful of food, every move is observed, reported, circumvented, or approved. So this idea of everything here, every layer of control in this land. And I'm conscious we've gone quite over our time, but we've got a couple more ideas that I think will be helpful for you here. So the control of information in Gilead shows how authoritarian control in a dystopia creates a climate of fear. So we've talked about Offred's role as controlling the narrative before, but here we can see that on the linguistic level. So the idea of language as linked to power here. This is linked to books and bookcases. So withholding, rewriting, revising, revealing in Offred's language, but then thinking about information as power here in restricted areas that speaks to this being an oasis of the forbidden here. This also being linked to the news. Serena always lets us, the household, watch the news, such as it is. Who knows if any of it is true? Could be old clips, it could be faked. But I watch it anyway, hoping to be able to read beneath it. Any news now is better than none. So then, power, she is able to determine if they watch it or not. But also this idea of access. They don't know what they have access to, but something is better than nothing here. We've seen the Bible quote already, again workable here when thinking about information and who controls it. This is talking about the newscaster in the same segment. What he's telling us, his level smile implies, is for our own good. Everything will be all right soon, I promise. There will be peace. You must trust. You must go to sleep like good children. He tells us what we long to believe. He's very convincing. I struggle against him. He's like an old movie star, I tell myself, with false teeth and a face job. At the same time, I sway towards him, like one hypnotized. If only it were true. If only I could believe. So again, the newscaster here, the propaganda of Gilead, is very paternalistic. It's controlling what they know. Of course, it's a man also here as the newscaster. And this idea of going to sleep like good children. Paternalistic, yes, but also thinking of this as sleep as submission to Gilead here, and the role of the handmaids and the people of Gilead is to submit like children to what the government is telling them. So very much big brother ideas again here. And then the sway towards him like one hypnotized. So the idea of the power of this information and of this source being so strong that she really has to struggle against it and fight against it. And that indicates her own rebellion as well. As well, we've seen this dangling, the control of information here, even in something as sort of unimportant as a magazine from a long time ago. The pen we looked at in our last lesson, the pen is power, again, the power of the words it contains. Pen is envy, as Aunt Lydia would say. That's a pun on penis envy, which is a Freudian term thinking about Freud believed that women were jealous of men's penises because they wanted the power and control that it was imbued with in society. And this has been changed to pen is envy. This idea of pen, words, information, control is now what women want. And that's linked to masculinity in this society. Reading, no, that's only a hand cut off on the third conviction. So this idea of the punishment of access to information to which they're not allowed to have. And then, this is with Dolores again, the moaning on and off. What did they do to her? We whispered from bed to bed. I don't know. Not knowing makes it worse. So that, then thinking about the lack of information leading to this fear-mongering. And Becker saying that Atwood's strongest manifesto for the freedom of the press, its abolition in the novel signals an end to individual freedom and human rights. So the dehumanization that comes with lack of information there and the control of information only to certain groups. But of course, we also have this as a tool of control and resistance, because there's something powerful in the whispering of the handmaids about those in power and talking about them in a negative way. Something delightful, naughty, secretive, forbidden, thrilling, like a spell. We've talked about amulets and charms before. Here, now we're thinking of spells and language as spells that is very much against the language of Christianity, or the sect of Christianity that Gilead ascribes to. That it deflates and reduces the people in power to a common denominator. In the washroom, someone has written Aunt Lydia sucks. It's like a flag waved from the top of a hilltop in rebellion. Thinking about this again as an amulet, as a form of resistance in language. The same with Offred in her own narrative. In fact, I don't think anything of the kind. I put it in only afterwards. Maybe should have thought about that at the time, but I didn't. As I said, this is a reconstruction. So we've talked about in previous lessons a lot about the control of language and the fact that Offred withholds power and control from us because she is telling her story here, and thus is withholding some power the same way that she withholds her name from us. The same with her story here about here's what I'd like to tell. I'd like to tell a story about how Moira escaped for good this time. Or if I couldn't tell that, I'd like to say how she blew up Jezebel's with 50 commanders inside. I'd like her to end with something daring and spectacular, some outrage, something that would befit her. But as far as I know, that didn't happen. I don't know how she ended, or even if she did, because I never saw her again. So again, the lack of knowing. She wants to be able to tell the story, but it's not true. And she admits that to us, that we can't know that story. So thus we are powerless to hearing about Moira as well. Then in speaking to Serena Joy, Offred says, yes, ma'am, I said again, forgetting. They used to have dolls for little girls that would talk if you pulled a string at the back. I thought I was sounding like that, the voice of a monotone, the voice of a doll. There she has become a plaything, an object, just a mouthpiece for the voice of Gilead, responding or being silenced to it, given this one-track idea, even her control of language in speaking to Serena Joy in private. But the handmaids still resist. And when we're kneeling, heads bowed slightly, so this fundamentally prayer-associated position and submissive position, there's a susurration, in fact, it's a whisper. Like the rustling of insects in tall, dry grass, a cloud of whispers. There's one of those places we can exchange news more freely, pass it from one to the next. It's hard for them to single out any one of us or hear what's being said, and they wouldn't want to interrupt the ceremony. So the handmaids, even just before the ceremony, are whispering because they know they can get away with it here and can pass it on. A collective murmur goes up from us. The crimes of others are a secret language among us. This is when Aunt Lydia says that they won't say what the women did. Through them, we show ourselves what we might be capable of after all. So this idea of language and information being empowering, Aunt Lydia realizing that and withholding that information in order to continue the oppression. When Offred meets the new Ofglen, she tries to get information about the old Ofglen and says, I am Ofglen. The woman said, word perfect. And of course she is, the new one. And Ofglen, wherever she is no longer Ofglen. I never did know her real name. That's how you can get lost in a sea of names. So this language being linked to individuality and power and identity has been lost. So the fact that she doesn't know Ofglen's name means that she's lost her forever and she won't be able to find her. And the fact that language is really important to keep safe in this society as well, because it can all be questioned. This is Janine, which I referenced before. It's Janine telling us how she was gang raped at 14 and had an abortion. She told the same story last week. Interesting. Old wives' tale, handmaid's tale story. She seemed almost proud of it while she was telling. It may not even be true. At testifying, it's safer to make things up than to say you have nothing to reveal. But since it's Janine, it's probably more or less true. But whose fault was it? Aunt Helena says, holding up one plump finger. Her fault, her fault, her fault, we chant in unison. So this idea then of the stories being told, this narrative being created that is controlling the handmaid's response and thus controlling how people react to women and violence here, but also questioning and doubting this, and maybe even we're not believing women now, even in a group of all women, about their assault. As I referenced before as well, blessed are the silence. I knew they made that up. I knew it was wrong and they left things out too, but there was no way of checking. And that's really the point here, isn't it? Is that she knows that it's wrong, but she can't check it because she doesn't have access to a Bible to actually check it. There's something subversive about this garden of Serena's, a sense of buried things bursting upwards wordlessly into the light, as if to point to say, whatever is silence will clamor to be heard, though silently. These plants, as we've spoken about before, the flowers and plants are linked with sexuality. And so when Serena is tending them, it's often about the control of that sexuality, but also the idea that it's growing regardless of any attempt to control it. And this idea of growing, bursting upwards, suggests that sexuality can never fully be controlled, obviously, as we see with Offred and Nick. And then even in the names of shops, you can see the place under the lily where the lettering was painted out when they decided that even the names of shops were too much temptation for us. Now places are known by their signs alone. So this idea that language being linked to temptation and thus to control because they were painted out and so taken away. But you can still see the place. You still have that indicator, that memory of the past. Of course, we also need to think of Moira as the rebellious antithesis to Offred's capitulation, and her being this inspiration. She was said it was different. The balance of power was equal between women, so sex was an even Steven transaction. So then Moira thinking of this of sex as rebellious, lesbian and queer resistance to heteronormative and patriarchal society, means it leads to more equality there. Distancing themselves from phallocentric sex is creating this language of equality because there is an equality between the women in that dynamic. The same with the toilets. Bodily functions at least remain democratic. So this idea that Moira points out what has remained the same, and this crassness really speaks to the reality. She's the voice of reason here, and some things even Gilead can't control, and female toilets being this kind of female sanctuary where she and Moira are actually able to connect and even touch. But Moira, again, being the voice of reason in a really desperate, urgent way, slapped her across the face. Get back here, get right back here. You can't stay there. You aren't there anymore. That's all gone. Talking to Janine of Warren here. Realistic and violence, but used to save Janine here. She's the hero here, trying to resist, even if that means using violence. Same as in the next quotation. And she says, I left that old hag, Aunt Elizabeth, tied up like a Christmas turkey behind the furnace. I wanted to kill her. I really felt like it. This idea of the disrespect, dismantling the system of that old hag rather than Aunt Elizabeth, the respect there and the power. But wanting to kill her, that violence again of resistance and rebellion, wanting to actually destroy her. The same in the language Moira uses, rather than there's a balm, a hymn, which is a religious song, a balm in Gilead, there's a bomb in Gilead, is what Moira used to call it. So again, the language being subversive in it, rejecting the power of the language here. And Moira being our fantasy, an interesting language there, because there we have her as almost larger than life and thus as something intangible, something that can't be controlled or harnessed, maybe. We hugged her to us. She was with us in secret, a giggle. She was lava beneath the crust of daily life. That metaphorical language there, so helpful for thinking about her as boiling up, erupting, live and moving, even under this restriction and rigidity of Gilead. In the light of Moira, the aunts were less fearsome and more absurd. Their power had a flaw to it. They could be shanghaied in toilets. The audacity was what we liked. Moira was like an elevator with open sides. She made us dizzy. Already we were losing the taste for freedom. Already we were finding these walls secure. In the upper reaches of the atmosphere, you'd come apart, you'd vaporizing. There was no pressure holding you together. So here pointing out that Moira is reminding them about what life used to be like, and that she is reminding them because they're already too comfortable, they're already submitting to their restrictions, the idea of walls, the losing the taste, vaporizing by reaching out, having too much power, you would evaporate. So thinking about her as someone who's reminding them of the importance of freedom because they've started to think of it as a negative thing. Her being this embodiment of female resistance and solidarity. But also because she's realistic. She was not stunned the way I was. So Offred being much more naive and submissive and weak in a way than Moira. In some ways she was gleeful, as if this was what she'd been expecting for some time, and now she'd been proven right. She looked even more energetic, more determined. So she is really empowered to resist in Gilead here, and thus her descent into Jezebel's becomes much more frightening because she's fallen so much further. Here, she's frightening me now because what I hear in her voice is indifference, a lack of volition. Have they really done it to her then? Taken away something? What? That used to be so central to her. And how can I expect her to go on with my idea of her courage, live it out, act it out, when I myself do not? I do not want her to be like me. Give in. Go along, save her skin. That's what it comes down to. I want gallantry from her, swashbuckling, heroism, single-handed combat, something I lack. Bye, IGCSE. Good luck with your exams. Thank you for joining again. And so thinking about her, the relationship between Moira and Offred depends on Moira, and Moira being the hero, being resistance, Offred being dependent on people here. And when Moira gives up, then Offred not wanting her to, her wanting to continue to sacrifice and be this guiding light for her, and it being alarming for her that she has lost something there. And that idea of her courage, perhaps that's projection, an expectation that this woman, Moira, has to fulfill these expectations even for Offred. And then I don't know how she ended, or even if she did, because I never saw her again. So Moira perhaps is defeated, destroyed, survived, we don't know. Interestingly, she loses her name in that last sentence, so it's like she's been lost to the past as well. Weiss says that Moira is Offred's revolutionary alter ego, so that she is this kind of projection of what Offred wants to be but can't be or isn't. And then thinking about what Atwood's project in presenting power like this could be. So here, just thinking, and this is our final moments, so we will think about what we can leave ourselves with here in thinking. But if you happen to be a man sometime in the future and you've made it this far, please remember, you will never be subject to the temptation or feeling you must forgive a man as a woman. It's difficult to resist, believe me. But remember that forgiveness too is a power. To beg for it is a power, and to withhold or bestow it is a power, perhaps the greatest. Perhaps none of this is about control. Maybe it isn't really about who can own whom, who can do what to whom and get away with it, even as far as death. Maybe it isn't about who can sit and who has to kneel or stand or lie down, legs spread open. Maybe it's about who can do what to whom and be forgiven for it. Never tell me it amounts to the same thing. So finally, a subversion in Offred's own language, thinking about, is this about control, or is Offred and the women like her reminding herself and the audience there's a difference between taking power and having it forgiven and forgotten? And that leaves us with that final difficulty of power in The Handmaid's Tale as we think about who has it, who doesn't, and how it's maintained in Gilead. Thank you so much for joining. We've gone over our time, but hopefully you found this a really fulfilling and full amount of information about power and The Handmaid's Tale. I'll see you next week at the same time, 6:50 to 8:20 on Wednesday, and next Friday as well for our Rossetti Poetry Revision from 3 to 6 p.m. on our channel, Eleanor Does English as well, to revise everything you need to know about Rossetti ahead of the exam season. Bye for now, everyone. Very good luck on exams if you have them, and see you next time.